There are people in this world who go so quiet that the rest of us start to believe they were born that way. We forget there was ever a voice in there at all. We pass their houses and tip our hats and say morning, ma'am, into a silence so old it has stopped feeling like rudeness and started feeling like weather, just something that's always there, like the dust or the heat. I did that to a woman for 11 years. I rode past her gate twice a week for 11 years and never once heard her say a single word, and I told myself she had nothing to say. That's the lie a man tells when he doesn't want to do the work of wondering. Then one evening in the fall of 1875, 7 Comanche riders came down out of the breaks with the last light burning red on their backs, and they rode straight toward the one house in this whole burned-out country where they'd be most likely to die. And the silent woman walked out to meet them. She didn't run. She didn't reach for the rifle that I knew for a fact hung loaded above her door. She lifted one hand. And I swear before God, I heard her make a sound I'd never heard a white woman make in my life, and it stopped those 7 warriors cold in their saddles like she'd thrown a rope around all of them at once. I've been trying to understand what I saw that night for the rest of the years I've had. I'm an old man now and I still write it down wrong every time. But I'm going to try once more because she deserves it and because nobody else who was there is left to tell it. So pour yourself something. This one takes a while and it doesn't end where you think it will. My name is Wade Tolliver and I have kept a tally book my whole life. Started it for cattle, the way any sensible man does head count brands. The dates a cow drops a calf or a calf drops dead. But somewhere along the way I started writing other things in the margins. The day my wife Ellen took sick. The day she didn't get up. The price of nails. The shape of a cloud that looked, for about a minute, like her face, before the wind took it apart again the way the wind takes everything apart out here. I'm telling you about the tally book because it's the only reason I can be sure of the dates. A man's memory will lie to make a better story. But the book says Sept the 19th, 7 riders, the Halloran place, in my own cramped hand, and the ink is real, and so it happened. The Halloran place sat about 1.5 miles east of mine, down where the land folds itself into a shallow draw, and a thin creek runs through it that mostly isn't there in August. Bridget Halloran lived alone in a soddy that her husband had started and never finished, with a lean-to barn and 4 scrawny cows, and a garden she fought the grasshoppers for every single summer. I say Bridget Halloran like I knew her name back then. I didn't. I learned it later. For the 11 years I'm telling you about, I knew her in my own head as the quiet one, or sometimes, when I was feeling unkind, the deaf and dumb woman, though she was neither as it turned out. Her husband had been a loud man, Connor Halloran. Big through the shoulders, big through the voice, the kind of fellow who'd corner you at the Saturday market and talk at you for 40 minutes about drainage. He'd come west with grand notions and a wife who, people said, used to laugh. I never heard her laugh. I came into this country the spring after Connor died of a fever that went through the low farms like a scythe through wheat, and by then the laughing was already over. Already buried with him, people figured. She buried him herself, dug the hole herself. That part I do know for certain, because old Mrs. Prout rode out to help and Bridget wouldn't let her near the grave, just kept digging, and Mrs. Prout said the woman's hands were a ruin of blisters by the end, and she never made a sound the whole time, not one, not even when she lowered him in. After that she stopped talking. Not all at once, they said. It went the way a creek goes in a dry year, a little less each week until one day you ride past and there's just cracked mud where the water used to be, and you can't even point to the day it quit. I want to be honest with you because this is the part I'm ashamed of. For 11 years I thought of Bridget Halloran the way you think of a fence post, something on the landscape, something that had always been there and would always be there. I'd see her in her garden, bent over, and I'd lift my hand and she'd lift hers, and that was the whole of our friendship. A raised hand twice a week for 11 years. I never once asked myself what it costs a person to go silent. I never once asked what was in there, behind the silence, getting louder all the time with nobody to hear it. I'm asking now, a little late, but I'm asking. The 19th of September was a Sunday, and I remember the light was doing that thing it does in the fall here, where it comes in low and gold and turns the whole prairie into something that looks holy and means nothing. I'd ridden out to check my east fence, which is to say I'd ridden out to be alone, which is to say I'd ridden out because the house got too quiet on Sundays now that Ellen was 4 years gone, and the silence in my own walls had started to remind me too much of the silence over at the Halloran place. That's a thing I didn't understand until later, either. That I'd been keeping half an eye on that woman not because I was neighborly, but because we were the same kind of broke. Two people in two soddies a mile and a half apart, both of us having gone quiet in our own way, both of us pretending the quiet was a choice. I was up on the rise, where the land breaks toward the draw when I saw the dust. Now dust on the prairie is nothing. Dust is the wind's idea of a joke, but this dust had a shape to it, a moving point at the front, and I'd lived long enough in that country to know the difference between dust the wind makes and dust that men on horses make. I reined up. I shaded my eyes. Riders, coming hard out of the northwest, out of the breaks where no white man kept a road, riding the kind of line you only ride when something behind you is worse than whatever's ahead. I counted them as they crossed the open ground. 1, 3, then the rest bunched 7. Even at that distance, even with the sun in my teeth, I knew what they were. You learn the silhouette out here whether you want to or not. The way they sat their horses, low and forward and easy like the horse was just the bottom half of the man. No saddles to speak of. The long hair. The way they moved as one animal, 7 bodies thinking a single thought. Comanche. I'd love to tell you I felt some noble thing in that moment. I didn't. I felt my whole stomach go to water. The Red River War had been burning across the Panhandle all that year and the year before. The army driving the last free bands off the Llano Estacado, shooting their horses by the thousands at Palo Duro that past September, starving them onto the reservation up at Fort Sill one frozen, beaten family at a time. We'd all read the reports. We'd all heard the stories, some true and most not. By the fall of '75, there weren't supposed to be any free Comanche left in that country at all. They were supposed to be gone, settled, the newspapers said, like you'd settle a debt. And here were 7 of them, riding hard across open ground in the last light, where they had no business being alive. My second thought, God help me, it was my second thought, not my first, was the Halloran woman. Because the line they were riding, if you drew it out straight, went right through the draw, right through the thin creek that mostly wasn't there, right through the unfinished soddy where a silent woman lived alone with 4 cows and a rifle she'd never, to my knowledge, fired. I did the arithmetic a coward does. My place was behind me north. I could be home and barred up before full dark. The Halloran place was ahead and below, and to get there I'd have to ride down toward the riders, not away. I'd love to tell you I didn't hesitate. I hesitated. I sat there on the rise with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I did the arithmetic twice, and the answer came up the same both times, and the answer was ride home, Wade. She's not your wife. She's not your kin. She's a fence post. She's weather. And then I saw her come out of the soddy. She was so small from up there. A dark figure against the pale wall of the house, in the gray dress she always wore, with her hair pulled back the way she always pulled it. She came out and she stood in the bare dirt of her yard and she looked northwest, toward the riders, and she did not move. I thought she hadn't seen them. I started to holler some useless thing, get inside, though she was too far to hear me and couldn't have answered if she could. She'd seen them. She walked away from the house. Away from the door, away from the rifle above it, out toward the middle of her yard where the garden gave way to open ground, and she stopped there, in the open, with nothing between her and 7 warriors but air and dirt and the last of the daylight. I have replayed this so many times. The riders coming on, the dust boiling up gold behind them, the drum of 40 unshod hooves you could feel in the ground before you could hear it, and one small woman in a gray dress walking out to meet it, walking toward the thing every instinct in a body screams to run from. I kicked my horse down off the rise. I don't remember deciding to. My body decided for me, the way it sometimes will when the mind's too busy being a coward to be of any use. I went down that slope at a speed that should have killed us both, my old gelding scrambling and sliding, me half out of the saddle, and the whole way down I was thinking one stupid sentence over and over. I never even learned her name. I never even learned her name. I was maybe 400 yards out when the riders reached her. And here is the thing I came to tell you. Here is the thing I have never been able to get right on paper, though I've tried for 50 years. They didn't ride her down. 7 Comanche warriors, exhausted, hunted, with the army somewhere behind them and nothing left to lose, and they pulled up. Hard. The lead horse came up so sharp it sat back on its haunches, and the rest fanned out and stopped, and the dust rolled past them and over her and on across the yard. And for a long moment the whole world was just brown haze and the heaving of horses and a woman standing in the middle of it with her hand raised. She had her hand raised, palm out, not the way you raise a hand to ward off a blow, the way you raise a hand to say, I see you, I know you, stop. And then she made the sound. I was close enough now to hear it. It came out of her cracked and strange, a voice that hadn't been used for anything but breathing in 11 years, rusted clean through, but it came out, and it wasn't English and it wasn't a scream. It was a word, 2 words maybe, in a language I didn't know, low and rough and shaped wrong from disuse, the way a hinge sounds when a door's been shut a long, long time and somebody finally forces it. The lead warrior went very still. He was younger than I expected, though it was hard to tell through the dust and the dark coming on. He had a scar that pulled at one eyebrow and a way of holding his head that made you understand, instantly, that the other 6 would do whatever he did. He looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at a ghost, at someone you have spent a long time being certain was dead, who is standing in front of you alive in the wrong place, saying your name, or a name, or some word that landed in him like a stone in a still pond, because I watched it ripple all the way through him. He said something back. She answered, 3 words this time. Her voice broke on the last one, and she pressed her free hand flat against her own chest like she was trying to keep something inside her from getting out, or trying to push something out that had been stuck for 11 years. I pulled my horse up at the edge of the yard. Nobody looked at me. I had ridden hellbent down a hillside, certain I was riding to a killing, and I had arrived at, I didn't have a word for it, a reunion, a reckoning, something that had nothing to do with me at all. The young warrior swung down off his horse. He did it slow, careful, the way you dismount near a spooked animal, and I saw then how bad off they all were, the horses lathered and trembling, ribs you could count, a couple of the men slumped and gray, one with a dark stain down the whole left side of his shirt that wasn't dye. They'd been running a long time. They'd been running, I'd guess, for weeks. He walked toward her. He stopped an arm's length away. And Bridget Halloran, the silent one, the fence post. The weather, Bridget Halloran reached out and put her hand flat against the scar on his face, against the pull of it over his eyebrow like she'd put it there before, like she knew exactly where it would be, and she said one more word, and then her legs went out from under her. He caught her. He caught her like he'd been expecting to have to, an arm behind her back before she'd even started to fall, and he held her up, this hunted, dying man holding up a fainting woman in a dirt yard with the last light going purple in the west, and over the top of her bowed head he looked at me, finally, for the first time. He looked at me and I understood I was being measured, friend or threat, stay or go. My whole life, the next several minutes of it anyway, hanging on what a stranger read in my face. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got down off my horse, slow, hands where he could see them, and I walked into that yard, and I said the most useless and the most true thing I have ever said in my life. I said, "What can I do?" He didn't understand the words. I could see that. But he understood something because the hand that had drifted toward the knife at his belt drifted away again, and one of the others, an old man, gray-braided with a face like a dry riverbed, said something to him. And he answered, and whatever passed between them, the knife stayed where it was. Bridget stirred against his arm. She got her feet back under her, and she turned her head and looked at me, really looked at me, for what I realized was the first time in 11 years of raised hands, and her eyes were wet and wild, and full of something I'd never seen in a person before, a grief and a joy so tangled up together I couldn't have separated them with a knife. She opened her mouth, and the woman who hadn't said a word to a living soul since she buried her husband with her own blistered hands looked at me across that darkening yard, and said, in English, in a voice like a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut, "Help them, please, they're my family." Now, I have to stop here, because if I keep going I'll get to the part that I still can't always get through, and I want to do it right. You're sitting there thinking you know what kind of story this is. White woman, taken as a girl, raised among them, returned to her own people, never the same. We've all heard that story. The newspapers loved that story. The captivity narrative, they called it, and they made it gruesome on purpose because gruesome sold papers, and it let people feel righteous about what the army was doing out on the lawn. But that's not Bridget's story. Not exactly. Her story is stranger and sadder and harder than that, and I didn't learn the whole of it for years, in pieces, some from her and some from the old gray-braided man who I came to call Tomás, because his Comanche name was beyond my crippled tongue, and he had a Mexican mother and answered to it kindly enough. What I learned is this, and I'll give it to you the way it came to me, slow. Bridget Halloran was not taken. Bridget Halloran ran to them, once, a long time ago, and what she did out there on the plains in the worst winter of her life, the thing she could never tell her loud, grand-notioned husband, the thing she carried alone for so long it finally took her voice, is the reason 7 hunted men, with the whole United States Army at their backs, rode 140 miles out of their way through open country to reach her door. They had come to pay a debt. They had come because, years before, when she was barely more than a girl and the world had already taken everything from her once, Bridget had made a choice that saved a Comanche child's life and damned her own to silence. And the boy whose face she touched in the yard, the one with the scar over his eyebrow, he was that child. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And the light's going, and there's blood in the dirt I haven't told you about yet, and a decision coming that I'm not proud of, and a long cold night where everything could have gone another way. So let me get her inside first. Let me get the wounded one off his horse. Let me bar the door against the dark and the thing that was coming behind those 7 riders, the thing with brass buttons and a flag and orders. Let me catch my breath, the way I had to catch it that night. And then I'll tell you the rest. I didn't learn that until later either, but I'll give it to you now so you don't have to keep track of him as the one bleeding out on the floor, which is how I thought of him for most of that night. Essa. It means something like wolf in their tongue. Tomás told me once, though he said it crooked and laughed and said the boy had been named for a wolf's stubbornness and not its meanness, that there was a difference, and that white men never could keep the two straight. He was the gray one, the one with the dark stain down his whole left side. We got him off his horse the way you get a sack of wet sand off a wagon badly, and with a lot of grunting, and at the end of it he was on the ground and one of the others had to hold his head up out of the dirt because he couldn't do it himself. I want to set the scene right, because the scene is half the story. It was full dark by the time we had him inside. Bridget's soddy was one room and a sleeping loft, a dirt floor swept so hard it shone, a stove she fed with twisted prairie grass and dried dung the way we all did out there where a tree was a rumor. She had a lamp, one lamp, and she lit it, and that little circle of yellow light was the whole world for the next several hours. Beyond it was the dark, and in the dark were 6 warriors and 7 horses and a creek that mostly wasn't there. And beyond that, somewhere, coming, was the thing I hadn't told you about yet. I'll tell you now. There was a patrol behind them. Not close, a day, maybe 2, the young one with the scar said through Tomás, who had enough Spanish that he and I could limp toward each other across the gap. A cavalry patrol out of one of the new forts, running down the last of the bands the way you run down stray cattle after a roundup. Except these strays, they meant to put on a train to Florida or starve onto the reservation. And the warriors had been peeling off and doubling back and burning their own trail for 2 weeks to throw them. And they were so tired they could barely sit a horse. And Essa had taken a soldier's bullet through the meat below his ribs 4 days back, and it had not stopped weeping since. That's what was coming. Brass buttons and a flag and orders. And here I was, a white rancher in a white woman's house, with 6 free Comanche outside and a 7th dying on the floor, and a patrol of the United States Army a day's ride off. If they found me here, I'd hang. That was not a dramatic thought. That was just arithmetic, the cold kind, the kind I was so good at. Harboring hostiles, they'd call it. Aiding the enemy. They'd hanged men for less that very year and not bothered much with the trial. I knew all that, sitting in that little circle of lamplight. I stayed anyway. I'd like to claim that was courage. I've had 50 years to think about it, and I've decided it wasn't. It was that I had not been needed by another living soul since I packed dirt over Ellen's face, and a person can go a long time pretending he doesn't miss that, but he does. He misses it like water. And when somebody finally says, "What can I do?" and somebody answers, "Help," a man like me will walk into fire just to feel useful again. So that's why I stayed. Not for honor, for the simple animal hunger of being wanted. You can make of that what you like. Bridget did the doctoring. I want you to understand what I watched, because it undid every idea I'd been carrying about that woman for 11 years. She knelt over Essa and she cut his shirt away with a knife she pulled from somewhere in her gray skirts, and her hands did not shake. She put her fingers into the wound, into it, her bare fingers, while the boy bucked and the old man held him, and she found the ball where it had lodged against the bone, and she got it out with a pair of bullet forceps that she just had, in a tin box under her bed, like a woman who had once needed such a box and never let herself be without one again. She talked the whole time. That's the part. After 11 years of nothing, she talked. Low, steady, that rusted hinge voice loosening up word by word, and it was their tongue, the Comanche, coming back to her out of some deep buried place, rough and broken and then less broken, the way a spring runs muddy at first and then clears. She talked to Essa, and she talked to the old man, and she talked to the wound itself. It seemed like a steady river of words I couldn't understand, and the boy quieted under it, and the old man's hard riverbed face cracked into something I can only call wonder. The young warrior with the scar, his name was Ta, short for something longer, the leader, the one whose face she'd touched. He stood by the door the whole time, not helping, watching her hands and her mouth like a man watching the dead get up and walk. Twice I saw him reach toward her, some helpless small gesture, and pull the hand back. When she'd packed the wound with something green and bitter-smelling out of a pouch the old man gave her, and bound it tight, and the boy had stopped his thin high keening and gone into the gray sleep that's either healing or the start of dying, Bridget sat back on her heels. And she looked at her own hands. She held them up in the lamplight, both of them, slick and dark to the wrist, and she looked at them the way you'd look at hands that belonged to a stranger, and her face came apart. It didn't come apart loud. That was the worst of it. There was no wailing, just her face folding in on itself, slow, and the tears running and her not making a sound, the silence closing back over her even as her body shook with it. 11 years of practice at grieving without a noise, and it held, even then, even with her family bleeding on the floor in front of her. I did the only thing. I got down on the dirt next to her and I didn't touch her, because I sensed touching her was the one thing I must not do, and I just stayed there, close, in the lamplight, the way you stay near a fire on a cold night. And after a while her breathing evened out and she wiped her hands on her ruined skirt and she said in English, not looking at me, "You want to know?" It wasn't a question. I didn't pretend it was. "Yes," I said, "but only what you want to give." She was quiet so long I thought that was the end of it. The lamp ticked. Outside a horse blew and stamped. Somewhere far off a coyote asked the night a question and got no answer. Then she told me. Not all of it that night, the rest came later in pieces the way I said. But the bones of it she gave me there on the dirt floor with her dying boy between us. And I'm going to give it to you the way I finally understood it, straightened out, because she told it crooked and out of order, the way you tell a thing you've never told anyone. She'd been 20. This was the winter of 1860, 15 years before the night I'm telling you about. She'd come west with her first family, not Connor. This was before Connor, a father and 2 brothers and a mother, on a wagon bound for the same notions everybody's wagon was bound for. And somewhere out on the edge of the Comanche country, in country they had no business crossing that late in the year, the winter caught them. I don't mean weather. I mean the winter, the one the old-timers still spoke of with a flinch. The blue norther that came down off the plains in December of '60 and froze the cattle standing up and killed more people in a week than the Comanche killed in a decade, though the newspapers never tallied it that way because frozen settlers don't sell papers the way scalped ones do. Her family died in it, all of them, not to violence, to cold, and to the fever that comes after the cold, the lungs filling, the going gray, the going still. Her father first, then the youngest brother, then over 4 endless days the rest, in a stranded wagon in a draw not so different from the one we were sitting in. Bridget nursed every one of them and buried none of them, because the ground was iron and she had no strength left, and there were 5 of them and 1 of her. And at the end, she was alone in a wagon full of her frozen dead, with a storm screaming over the canvas, and no food, and no fire, and no reason left to keep breathing. She decided to walk out into the snow and stop. She told me this plainly on the dirt floor 15 years later. I went out to die, she said. I'd made up my mind. I lay down in it. It was warm after a while. They tell you it's warm at the end, and they're right. And that's when the Comanche found her. Not warriors, a family, a band moving south ahead of the same storm, looking for the same low ground out of the same wind, and they came on a frozen wagon and a girl lying down in the snow to die. And a woman of that band, Bridget never knew her real name, called her only the mother. That woman got down off her horse and would not leave her there. They could have. Understand that. A starving band in the worst winter in memory, with their own children to keep alive, came on a white girl who was nothing to them, whose people were killing their people up and down the plains that very year, and they could have ridden on and no one would ever have known or cared. And the mother got down in the snow and breathed warm air into the girl's blue face and would not leave her. They kept Bridget alive that winter. They fed her from food they did not have. The mother had a baby that season, born in the cold, a hard birth, and Bridget half dead herself, a stranger. A table girl who couldn't say 3 words of their tongue. Bridget sat up with that baby every night for a month while the mother healed, because it was the one thing she could do, the one way she could pay back people who would not let her die. The baby lived. The baby was named for a wolf's stubbornness. The baby was Essa. The boy on the floor between us, the one she just dug a soldier's bullet out of with her bare fingers, 15 years later, in a different draw, in a different war that was somehow the same war it had always been. I had to put my hand over my own mouth when I understood it. I'm not ashamed to say so. The lamp ticked and the boy breathed his gray, uneven breaths, and I sat there on the dirt with the whole shape of it landing on me at once. But that wasn't the debt. Not yet. Saving a baby is a beautiful thing, but it's not the kind of thing that makes 7 hunted men ride 140 miles to die at your door. There was more, and the more was the part that took her voice, and she gave it to me last and lowest, almost in a whisper, with her eyes on S's face the whole time. When the spring came, soldiers came too. A patrol, much like the one behind them now. History doesn't change its mind out here. It just changes the date. A cavalry patrol that found the band's winter camp in a draw and meant to do to them what cavalry patrols did. And Bridget, who by then could have run to the soldiers, who was a white girl and one shout away from rescue, who could have walked into the arms of her own people and gone home and never thought about any of it again. Bridget hid the children. That was the choice. That was the whole of it. When the soldiers came down on the camp, Bridget took the bobbies and the small ones, Essa among them, and she hid them in a wash under a cutbank, and she lay down on top of them in the brush. And when a trooper rode close enough that she could have called out, could have said, here, I'm white, save me, she stayed silent. She put her hand over Essa's small mouth, and she stayed silent, and she let the soldiers ride past, looking for her. Because by then they'd found the wagon and the frozen dead and knew there'd been a girl. And they were sure the Comanche had her, and they would have burned the whole band to the ground to get her back. She let them think she was dead. She chose 6 Comanche children over her own rescue. She lay in the brush with her hand over a baby's mouth and let her own people ride away. The band slipped off in the night. They took her south with them, and she stayed another year, and then, and this part she never fully explained and I never pushed, she went back, came north again. Married Connor Halloran, who was loud and grand and never knew, who could never have understood, who would have been horrified, who thought he'd married a quiet, sad widow-to-be, and never once guessed that the silence in his wife was the sound of a woman who had chosen the enemy's children over her own life and could never, ever tell a living soul. She'd carried it 15 years. The choice, the hand over the small mouth, the soldiers riding past. She'd carried it alone through a marriage and a widowing and 11 years in a soddy by a creek that mostly wasn't there, and she had stopped talking, finally, completely, because she said this, and I have never forgotten it, because the only words I had that were true were words nobody could ever hear. She'd had no one to say them to. Until 7 riders came down out of the breaks with the last light burning red on their backs, and one of them had a scar she'd watched him get as a child, and she walked out into her yard to meet the only people on earth who already knew. We sat with that a while, she and I, in the lamplight. Then I asked the question I had to ask, the cold arithmetic question, because somebody had to, and it wasn't going to be her. The patrol behind them, I said, how far? A day, she said. Ta thinks a day, maybe less. And they'll track them here. Yes. And when they get here, I said, slow, making myself say all of it, they'll find 6 warriors and a wounded one and a white woman who nursed them and a white man who helped, and they won't ask many questions. She looked at me. The lamp put 2 small flames in her eyes. No, she said, they won't. Outside, Ta and Tamaz were talking low, and I could hear in it the same arithmetic, the same cold sums being added up in another tongue. 6 men who could ride, 1 who couldn't, not for days, maybe not ever, horses gone to bone, a day's lead, maybe less, and a fork in the road that anybody could see coming. They could leave Essa. That's what the arithmetic said. 6 men on dying horses might outrun a fresh patrol if they rode light and rode now and didn't have to drag a gutshot boy across 100 miles of open ground. They might make the breaks, the deep canyons, the country soldiers feared to follow into. They might live, some of them, if they left the wolf-stubborn one behind. And Bridget, a white woman, alone, silent, harmless, Bridget might survive the patrol's questions if the warriors were gone, and there was only a sick man in her house she could swear up and down was a wandering Mexican, a hired hand, anything, anyone but what he was. That was the sane plan. That was the plan that saved the most lives. I could see Tamaz laying it out to Ta in the dark, the old man's voice patient and terrible, and I could see the shape of Ta's shoulders against the doorway, refusing it. I'd love to tell you, I had nothing to do with what happened next. But Bridget turned to me, on the dirt floor, with her boy breathing his gray breaths between us, and she asked me a question. And the question was the worst thing anyone has ever asked me, before or since. She said, "If they leave him here with me, will you help me hide him, knowing what it means if they find you?" And there it was, my fork, my choice. The cold arithmetic said no, Wade, ride home, you've done enough, this isn't your war, you'll hang. And it was right. The arithmetic was right. I sat there a long time. The lamp ticked. The boy breathed. Outside, an old man's voice and a young man's silence argued over which of them would get to die. I'm not going to tell you yet what I said. Because what I said isn't the end of it, and the patrol came faster than a day. And by morning, everything we decided in that lamplit room had to be decided all over again. Harder, with less time and more blood. And a choice none of us had seen coming was waiting out there in the gray dawn with the dew still on it. So let me leave us there for now. On the dirt floor, in the lamplight, a woman who'd found her voice asking a coward to be brave, and the coward not yet knowing what he'd say, and 7 horses standing hipshot in the dark, and somewhere to the north, just over the curve of the world, the small cold sound of bugles you can't hear yet but know are coming. I'll tell you the rest. I promised I would, and I will. But I have to catch my breath again. That's the trouble with telling the truth about a night like that one. You have to live it twice. I want to get that out of the way first, before I lose the nerve to, because I've come this far being honest and I won't quit now. She asked me would I help her hide the boy, knowing it meant the rope if they found us, and I sat there on the dirt floor doing my cold arithmetic, and the arithmetic said no, and I opened my mouth to say no, and what came out was yes. I have thought about that a great deal, how the body sometimes knows a thing the mind is still too cowardly to admit. My mouth said yes a full second before my mind caught up, and when my mind caught up it was furious. It called me 10 kinds of fool, and underneath the fury was a feeling I hadn't had since Ellen died, and it took me a while to name it. The feeling was relief. Like I'd been carrying my own life around for 4 years like a thing I didn't want and didn't know where to set down, and somebody had finally asked me for it, and I could put it down at last by spending it on something. That's a dangerous feeling. I don't recommend it, but I won't lie about having had it. Bridget didn't thank me. That was one of the things I came to love about her, in the small way an old man comes to love a thing he watched up close once. She didn't waste words on thanks anymore, having gone so long without any words at all. She just nodded, one nod, and got up off the floor and went to tell the others. But the others had already decided something of their own. I heard it before I understood it, the change in the talk outside. The low argument going hard and then going still, that particular stillness that comes after men have settled a thing they all wish they hadn't. I went out. The dark was thinning at the edges, not dawn yet but dawn's rumor. That gray hour when the world is the color of ash and everything looks already dead. The 6 able warriors were standing by their horses. The horses had been gathered and gentled, and the few possessions they had were lashed down tight, and I understood, looking at it, that they were leaving. But they weren't leaving the way Tamaz had argued for. They weren't slipping off south into the breaks, light and fast, abandoning the boy and trusting the dark. They were going to ride north, toward the patrol. Tamaz explained it to me in his patient, terrible Spanish, with Ta standing silent beside him. And I'll give it to you the way I finally pieced it together. The patrol would track 7 riders to this draw. There was no hiding that 7 horses leave a road a blind man could follow. So if the soldiers came on and found the trail leading in and no trail leading out, they'd tear the place apart, and they'd find the boy, and they'd find Bridget, and they'd find me, and that would be the end of all of us. Unless the trail led out again. 6 riders out. Riding hard, riding loud, riding north and west, drawing a road straight away from the Sadi and the creek and the wounded boy, leading the patrol off on a chase across open country toward the deep canyons where soldiers feared to follow. 6 riders out. The patrol would count the road and chase the 6 and never think to stop and search a poor white widow's farm. Because why would 6 men leave one of their own behind? Why would anyone do that? It made no sense. And a thing that makes no sense is a thing a tired cavalry lieutenant does not waste a morning on when there's a fresh trail to run. It was a good plan. It was a terrible good plan. Because the 6 on their dying horses would not outrun a fresh patrol, not all the way to the canyons, not with the army's grain-fed mounts under them. Some of them would not reach the breaks. They knew it. They'd done the arithmetic too, the same cold sums, and they'd come up with an answer that cost them more than it cost anybody, and they'd chosen it anyway. They were going to spend themselves to buy the boy a chance. 6 men. For one. And the one was wounded so bad he might die regardless, might die in the next 2 days no matter what anybody did, and they were going to ride out into the gray dawn and likely never come back, on the chance of it. I have spent a long time around men who called themselves brave. Men who'd whip a horse or whip a child or face down another man over a card game and strut about it after. I thought I knew what the word meant. I didn't know what the word meant until I stood in that ash-gray yard and watched 6 starving men get on 6 dying horses to ride toward the thing that would kill them, so that a boy they loved might wake up somewhere warm. Todd didn't get on his horse. That was the second thing I didn't see coming. He came to Bridget instead. She'd followed me out, and she stood in the doorway with the lamp behind her, and Ta came and stood in front of her in the gray light, and the 2 of them looked at each other a long moment with 15 years and a frozen winter and a hand over a baby's mouth standing in the air between them. He was going to stay. I understood it before either of them said anything. He was the leader. The 6 would follow Tamaz now, and Ta was going to stay behind with Bridget and the boy, because if the worst happened, if the patrol did stop, if they did search, then one warrior in the brush with a rifle was a chance, however small, and one man's stubbornness against the whole United States Army was apparently the kind of arithmetic Ta believed in. Bridget said no. She said it in their tongue, and then when he wouldn't hear it, she said it in English, low and fierce, and the gist of it was this, and I'll never forget it. If you stay, they find you, and they find Essa, and they find all of us, and your dying buys nothing. Ride. Lead them off. Live. That's how you pay me back, by living, not by dying in my yard. I already spent my whole life buying you one morning. Don't waste it. He stood there. The light was coming up now, pink along the rim of the world. The other 5 were mounted and waiting, and the horses were stamping, eager and exhausted both, the way horses get when they know the running is about to start. And Todd did a thing I've only ever seen done once. He took off something from around his neck, a small thing, a worn thing, I couldn't see what, and he put it in Bridget's hand and closed her fingers over it, and he said 3 words, and then he turned and got on his horse without looking back, because I think if he'd looked back he couldn't have done it, and the 6 of them went out of that yard at a dead run with the dawn coming up red behind them. And the drum of the hooves rolled away north and west across the open ground, and got smaller and smaller, until it was just a memory of thunder, and then nothing at all. Bridget stood holding whatever he'd given her. She didn't open her hand to look at it. Not then. She just held it against her chest, the way she'd pressed her own hand to her chest in the yard the evening before, holding something in or holding something together, and she watched the empty place on the horizon where her family had gone, and the silence came down over the farm again so complete you could hear the lamp guttering inside. Then she said, without turning around, "We have until they come. Help me move him." We moved Essa. There was an old root cellar dug into the side of the draw behind the Sadi, half caved in, the kind of thing everybody had and nobody used. We carried the boy down into it on a blanket, the 2 of us, slow and careful, his gray breath fogging in the cold of the earth, and we laid him on a bed of dry grass and old sacking, and Bridget arranged it all so that if you pulled the broken door aside and looked in, you'd see a ruin full of rubbish and shadow, and not the shape of a wounded man under the rubbish, if you didn't look too hard. We were betting everything on a tired lieutenant not looking too hard. Then we waited. I won't draw the waiting out the way the waiting drew itself out. There's no telling it right anyway. The way time goes thick and strange when you're listening for hoofbeats. The way every bird call makes your heart stop. The way Bridget and I sat in her swept-clean soddy drinking coffee we couldn't taste and saying nothing. Both of us gone back to our native silence. Two quiet people waiting for the loud world to come and find us. I'll tell you only one thing about the waiting. At some point, Bridget opened her hand and looked at what Ta had given her. It was a small flat piece of bone, worn smooth, with a hole bored in it and a bit of sinew through the hole so it could be worn around a neck. On the bone, someone had scratched a shape, crude, a child's work, the kind of thing a small boy might scratch with a sharp stone to pass a long winter. It was a wolf, a child's idea of a wolf. Bridget made a sound when she saw it. Not a word, just a sound sharp like something breaking, and then she closed her hand over it again and looked at the wall and didn't make any more sounds at all. And I understood without being told that the boy Essa had made that thing years ago, 100 years ago, in another winter, and had given it to Ta to give to her, and that some messages take 15 years to arrive and arrive anyway, exactly on time. The patrol came an hour after that. They came faster than a day. They came the way the six had gambled they would, straight down the 7-horse road, hard, 20-some troopers and a lieutenant out front, and I watched them top the rise in the full morning light, and I felt my whole life narrow down to the next few minutes the way it does. The lieutenant was young. They always were, the ones doing the worst of that work. Younger than Ta, I'd guess, with a sunburned neck and a mustache he was still growing into and eyes that had already seen more than the mustache let on. He rode into the yard and his men spread out behind him the way they're trained to, and he looked at me, and he looked at the soddy, and he read the 7-horse road coming in and the 6-horse road going out, and I watched him do the arithmetic. "You," he said to me, "you see riders come through here." 6, I said, the number mattered. If I lied and said none, the road called me a liar. If I told the truth as far as it went, I had a chance. 6 of 'em, Comanche, come through hard about dawn, headed northwest, didn't stop. We hid in the cellar till they was gone. I let my voice shake. It didn't take much acting. Thought we was dead, Lieutenant. Thought we was surely dead. He looked at Bridget. She was in the doorway, gray dress, hair pulled back, hands folded, the very picture of a poor frightened widow, which she was, except for all the ways she wasn't. "This your wife?" "Neighbor," I said. "Widow Halloran. I come over of an evening to help with her stock. She don't," and here I made the gamble, the big one, the one that turned on everything I'd learned about her in one long night. "She don't speak, sir. Lost her voice years back when her husband passed. Hasn't said a word since. You won't get nothing from her but a nod." I felt Bridget go still behind me. I felt the danger of it, that I'd boxed her in, that if he pressed her and she had to choose between her silence and the boy in the cellar, I'd handed her an impossible thing. But I'd bet that her silence, her famous unbreakable silence, was the best cover we had. A woman who can't speak can't be tricked into a lie. A woman who can't speak is harmless. A woman who can't speak gets searched less hard. The lieutenant looked at her a long moment. And Bridget Halloran, who had found her voice not 18 hours before after 11 years of nothing, who had used it to do surgery and to tell the worst truth of her life, and to send her family riding to their deaths with an order to live. Bridget Halloran looked the young soldier dead in the eye and went silent again. On purpose, for the boy. She put her hand to her own throat and shook her head, slow, sorrowful, and her eyes filled. And they were real tears. I knew they were real, but the lieutenant read them the way I'd hoped he would, as a frightened mute widow's tears, and not the tears of a woman strangling her own voice in her fist to keep a child alive. And she dropped her gaze to the dirt and stood there trembling, harmless, broken, silent. She spent her voice to get it. and then she gave it back up. That was the bravest thing I ever saw a person do, and there was no one to see it but me, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be a witness worthy of it, which is part of why I'm telling you this now." The lieutenant grunted. He sent 2 men to look in the soddy, and they came out and shook their heads. His eye went to the caved-in cellar, and my heart stopped clean in my chest and stayed stopped. He looked at the 6-horse road going northwest. Fresh. Hard. A real chase, a real chance at the medals and the mention in dispatches that a young lieutenant needed, right there, riding away from him by the minute. He looked back at the broken cellar full of rubbish and shadow. And he did the lazy human thing, the merciful accident, the small ordinary failure of attention that the 6 had bet 6 lives on. He chose the fresh trail over the cold ruin. He wheeled his horse. "Northwest, you said?" "Northwest, sir, hard as they could go." "How long?" Hour and a bit." He nodded, already gone in his mind, already chasing. He touched his hat brim to Bridget, "Ma'am," with a young man's automatic courtesy to a grieving widow, and I have wondered since whether that scrap of manners was the thread the whole thing hung on, whether a ruder man would have torn the cellar apart out of spite, and I've decided it probably was, that we lived because a tired boy soldier was raised to tip his hat to women, and that the world turns on hinges that small. Then he gave the order, and 20-some troopers went up out of the draw and away to the northwest in a long rolling cloud of dust, chasing 6 dying men toward the canyons, and the sound of them faded the way the sound of the 6 had faded an hour before, until there was nothing again but the lamp quiet and the wind and a woman holding a child's bone wolf against her chest. I won't tell you the 6 all died. I won't tell you they all lived either, because they didn't, and I won't dress it up. What I know is this. 3 weeks later, a young Comanche I'd never seen rode down out of the breaks at dusk alone and left a thing on Bridget's fence post and rode off without coming near the house. A thing that meant, Bridget told me, that some of them had made the canyons. Not all, some. Tomaz's name was not in the message. Taz was. Which side of the ledger that left the old man on, I never learned, and Bridget never said, and there are some debts you don't get to see settled. Asa lived. That's the thing I can give you clean. The wolf-stubborn boy lived. He was a long time mending in that broken cellar, and then a longer time mending in the soddy when we judged the danger past, and Bridget nursed him the way she'd nursed him through his first winter, the circle closing, the debt running both directions now, until you couldn't tell any more who owed what to whom, which is, I think, the only honest way debts between people ever end. He had her voice back by spring. I mean that the way it sounds. By spring Bridget Halloran talked to him, in their tongue, and to me in mine, and once that I heard she laughed, and I had to walk out to the barn and stand a while because I'd been told this woman used to laugh, and I'd never believed it until I heard it. 11 years and one long night too late. The rustiest, most beautiful sound, like a creek coming back to a bed that had been dry so long it had forgotten the shape of water. Essa stayed 2 years. Then the country got too dangerous for a young Comanche man to be living at a white widow's farm, and we all knew it, and one morning he was gone north, toward the reservation where what was left of his people were trying to learn to be something the government could file away. He left the bone wolf on Bridget's pillow. She'd kept it on the fence post all that time, where Ta had meant it to stay, and the boy took it down and gave it back to the woman who'd earned it twice, and then he rode away into a future I can't follow him into, because I don't know it, because nobody told me, because some stories you only get to hold the middle of. Bridget lived another 14 years in that soddy by the creek that mostly wasn't there. We were friends, the real kind, the quiet kind, 2 people who'd stopped pretending the quiet was a choice. She talked when she had something true to say and was silent the rest of the time, and I never once, after that night, mistook her silence for emptiness. She's buried up on the rise now, the one I rode down off of, the one where I first saw the dust take a shape and move. I dug the hole myself. I wouldn't let anybody near it, and I understood, finally, doing it, why she'd done the same for Connor all those years before, That there are some people you have to put into the ground with your own hands or it doesn't take. The grief doesn't take. It just floats there unfinished. I put the bone wolf in with her. I hope that was right. She never told me to, and she never told me not to, and a man has to guess sometimes at the end about what the silent ones would have wanted. I'm an old man now, like I said. My own tally book is nearly full, and I've told you this the best I can, which is not very well, because the truth of that night was always bigger than my crippled hand could hold. But I'll tell you the one thing I'm sure of, the thing I built the rest of my life around after I watched it happen in a dirt yard in the fall of 1875. For 11 years I thought silence was a kind of nothing, a blank, an absence where a person used to be. It isn't. Silence is the loudest thing there is when you finally learn to hear it. It's a held breath. It's a hand over a baby's mouth. It's a woman carrying a true word for 15 years because there's no one alive who could bear to hear it. And the mercy of this world, what little of it I've seen, is mostly just this. Now and again, against all the cold arithmetic, somebody rides 140 miles out of their way to be the one who finally can. She lifted her hand, they stopped. I never did learn the word, she said.